I never thought of myself as the type of person who would be standing in the middle of a dark living room at 3 in the morning, holding a bag of takeout, paralyzed by the sound of muffled laughter coming from my own bedroom. It is the kind of thing you see in movies or hear about on those late-night subreddits, the ones you scroll through while eating lukewarm pasta, thinking, thank God that is not my life. But that night, as the hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder, amplifying the thumping in my own chest, I realized that I was no longer the audience. I was the protagonist of a tragedy I hadn't even realized was being written. My life in Chicago had been, by all standard metrics, perfectly predictable. I worked in project management for a mid-sized marketing firm in the Loop. I paid my mortgage on time, and I kept my circle small. My best friend Tyler had been a fixture in my life since our sophomore year of college. We were the kind of guys who finished each other's sentences, the ones who had weathered breakups, job losses, and the general existential dread of our late 20s together. When Tyler told me he had lost his apartment due to a series of compounding financial disasters, a mix of bad investments, a layoff, and a landlord who didn't care about personal circumstances, it was a no-brainer. My place was a 2-bedroom condo in Lincoln Park, and while I liked my solitude, the guest room was essentially a storage unit for half-unpacked boxes and a stationary bike I never used. I told him it was only for a month, maybe 2, until he could get his finances back on track and put down a deposit on a new place. He was incredibly grateful, or at least he put on a hell of a performance of gratitude. He helped out with groceries, he handled the dishes, and he was always there with a cold beer and a laugh when I got home from a grueling 10-hour day. It felt like we were back in our college glory days, just older, slightly more tired, and a hell of a lot more stable. Or so I thought. The betrayal didn't start with a bang. It started with a subtle shift in the atmosphere that I was too busy to notice. Looking back, the signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs I was too stupid to follow. It was the way Tyler started wearing my cologne, or how he would subtly position himself whenever my girlfriend, Sarah, would come over for dinner. At the time, I just chalked it up to him being comfortable, being part of the fold. Sarah and I had been together for 18 months, and we were at that comfortable stage where the novelty had worn off, but the commitment felt solid. She worked as an architect, often staying late at the firm, which meant that Tyler and Sarah spent a surprising amount of time together in my apartment while I was stuck in the office. They would talk about design, about the city, about things that didn't really interest me, and I would just sit there, feeling a strange, hollow sense of contentment that my favorite people were getting along. The night everything changed started as one of the most boring days of my life. A massive client presentation had gone sideways, and I ended up trapped in a boardroom until well past midnight. My phone was dead, my head was throbbing, and all I wanted was a shower and my own bed. I had forgotten my charger, so the rideshare home was a silent, agonizing slog through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago. When I finally pulled up to my building, the city felt unusually quiet, a heavy, oppressive stillness that should have been a warning. I let myself in, dropping my keys on the foyer table with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I walked toward the kitchen, intending to drop the bag of late-night takeout I had grabbed from a 24-hour deli on the way home. The living room was bathed in the faint, bluish glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. That was when I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound. Not quite talking, not quite silence. It was coming from the bedroom. My bedroom. My brain didn't want to process the reality of it. It tried to search for a logical explanation. Maybe Sarah had come over early. Maybe Tyler was watching a movie with the volume way down. But the sound continued, a sharp, ragged intake of breath that pierced through the quiet of the night. I felt my legs moving before my mind gave the order. I wasn't angry yet. I was in a state of clinical detachment, as if I were floating above my own body, watching a stranger walk toward a locked door. My hand hovered over the brass knob. It was cold. I stood there for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, listening. A voice, unmistakable and impossibly familiar, floated through the wood. It was Tyler. He said something low and possessive, and then I heard Sarah's voice, a soft, breathless laugh that I had heard 1,000 times in moments of intimacy, but never like this. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated surrender. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The floor felt soft, like I was walking on something unstable. My pulse wasn't racing anymore. It was slowing down, turning into a heavy, rhythmic thud in my ears. I didn't kick the door open. I didn't shout. I just turned around. I walked back into the living room, sat down on the edge of the sofa, and stared at the dark wall. My hands were shaking so violently that I couldn't even manage to open the plastic bag of food. I just sat there, the smell of grease and salt filling the room, listening to the muffled sounds of my life being dismantled in the next room over. I felt like an intruder in my own home. Everything in the apartment, the books on the shelves, the framed photos of Sarah and me on the mantle, the very chair I was sitting on, suddenly felt like a prop in a play I hadn't been cast in. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had poured into this place, the years of work, the way I had defended Tyler to my other friends when they said he was a mooch. I had literally fed him, housed him, and protected him while he was busy carving out a space for himself in my bed. The irony was so bitter it felt physical, like bile rising in my throat. I wondered how long this had been going on. Weeks? Months? Had they been laughing at me while I sat right there on this same couch, oblivious to the signals they were trading under my nose? My mind raced through the last few months, replaying every dinner, every movie night, every time Sarah had stayed over while I was exhausted. Each memory, once innocent, was now being tainted by this new, ugly reality. The way they looked at each other, the inside jokes, the way Sarah would sometimes move away from me when I tried to put my arm around her, it all clicked into place with a horrifying, surgical precision. I realized then that I didn't just feel betrayed by a woman I loved. I was mourning the loss of the only male friendship that had mattered to me since I was 20. Tyler wasn't just a friend. He was the person I called when I needed to vent, the guy who knew exactly how I took my coffee, the brother I never had. And he had looked at me every single day, knowing exactly what he was doing to me. And he had chosen this. He had chosen to violate the one sanctity I had left, my home. I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, and walked to the kitchen. I didn't want to see them. I couldn't bear the thought of them emerging from that room, flushed and disheveled, and having to perform the charade of human decency. I grabbed a glass of water, my hands still trembling, and took a long, steady drink. The water was tepid and tasted like tap, but it grounded me just enough to keep from screaming. I could hear the bed frame creaking against the wall, a sound that would be etched into my memory for the rest of my life. I walked to the front door, my keys still sitting on the table where I had dropped them. I didn't take my coat. I didn't pack a bag. I just walked out into the cool Chicago night, leaving everything behind. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew that if I stayed in that room for one more second, I was going to do something that would destroy the rest of my life. I walked down the stairs, out into the drizzle, and started walking toward the lake. I needed to see the water. I needed to see something that wasn't a lie. The city lights reflected off the puddles, turning the asphalt into a shattered mirror. I kept walking, my shoes soaking through with cold, dirty water, but I didn't care. I felt like a ghost, a specter haunting the streets of a city that had been my home for a decade. Every car that passed, every person huddled under an umbrella, every neon sign flickering in the distance, it all felt alien. I was untethered. My reality had been cut clean, and I was drifting into a void where nothing was certain anymore. I wondered if they knew I was gone. I wondered if they would even notice before morning. I imagined them in the silence of the aftermath, maybe sharing a cigarette, maybe talking about how awkward it would be when I got home. I realized with a sick clarity that they probably didn't even care about my feelings. When you betray someone that deeply, you have to dehumanize them first. You have to convince yourself that the person you're hurting isn't really a person at all, but a character in your own story, someone whose feelings don't matter as much as the heat of the moment. I stopped at a bridge, leaning my arms against the cold, wet railing and looking out at the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. It was black and infinite, a void that matched the one in my chest. I thought about calling my brother, or maybe a friend from work. But what would I even say? How do you explain that your best friend and your girlfriend have turned your world into a crime scene? The words felt too heavy, too jagged. I just stayed there, shivering in the damp air, letting the wind bite into my skin until I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. I was thinking about the money too, the rent, the utilities, the groceries. Tyler had been struggling, so I had covered almost everything for months. I had been subsidizing his affair. I had been paying for the privilege of being played. It was such a pathetic, mundane detail, but it cut deeper than the infidelity itself. It was the financial aspect of the betrayal, the way he had exploited my kindness while he was sleeping with my woman, that felt like the ultimate insult. He hadn't just taken my trust, he had taken my resources. He had taken my labor and used it to fuel his own selfish desires. I finally reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was still dead, a useless slab of metal and glass. I felt a weird sense of relief. No one could reach me. No one could force me to confront the wreckage yet. I decided then that I wouldn't go back until the morning. I would spend the night out here, in the cold, letting the reality of it wash over me until it didn't burn quite so badly. I would figure out how to navigate the aftermath once I had a plan. But for now, I just needed to exist in the silence, to acknowledge that the life I had built had been a house of cards, and someone had just blown the door off the hinges. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the railing. I could still hear the faint echoing sound of that laugh. It was going to haunt me for a long time. I was alone, I was betrayed, and I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do when the sun finally came up. The sun didn't bring any clarity, only the harsh, unforgiving light of morning that made the city look exhausted and gray. I spent the night wandering aimlessly through the loop, then retreating into a 24-hour diner where I sat in a booth for hours, nursing a black coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. When I finally walked back to my building, the sun was high and the streets were coming alive with the usual rush of commuters. I felt like a stranger looking at a different planet. I approached the front door of my condo, my keys heavy in my hand, and hesitated. The silence behind that door wasn't just physical anymore, it was moral. I turned the key as quietly as possible, praying that the place would be empty, that they had both scurried off like the rats they were. The apartment was still, the air thick with the scent of stale air and the ghost of the previous night. I walked straight to the kitchen, and my heart sank. There, on the counter, was a half-empty bottle of wine and 2 glasses. One was tipped over, a dark red stain drying on the marble surface. It was such a domestic, casual sight, and it made me want to burn the whole place to the ground. I didn't see Tyler, but I heard the shower running in the guest bathroom. I stood there, paralyzed, holding the keys that represented my mortgage, my life, my stability. I realized then that my anger was no longer a hot, sharp blade. It had settled into something colder and much more dangerous. It was a calculated, icy resolve. I walked into the living room and sat down on that same sofa. I didn't hide, I didn't run, and I didn't call out. I just waited. 10 minutes later, the bathroom door creaked open, and Tyler stepped out, wrapped in a towel, humming some tune under his breath. He stopped dead when he saw me sitting there in the living room, still wearing the damp, wrinkled clothes from the night before. The look on his face wasn't even shock. It was a flicker of something far more pathetic. Fear mixed with a desperate attempt to craft a lie on the spot. He stood there, dripping water onto my hardwood, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit or a weapon. I didn't speak. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see my best friend. I saw a man who had lived in my house, eaten my food, and smiled at me for months while he was busy gutting my life from the inside out. He finally opened his mouth, and the pathetic, stuttering excuses began to spill out. He talked about how it was a mistake, how it just happened, how he didn't mean for any of this to occur. I sat there in silence, listening to him dig his own grave, and all I could think about was the money. I thought about the thousands of dollars he owed me in back rent, the utilities I had covered, the groceries that were currently sitting in the fridge he was so happy to empty. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. This wasn't just about a woman. This was about the absolute violation of a contract of friendship that I had honored while he had treated it like a buffet. I didn't yell. I didn't hit him. I just stood up, walked into the guest room, and started throwing his things into a duffel bag. I didn't care if I broke his laptop or tore his shirts. I just started tossing everything: his shoes, his chargers, the cheap cologne he bought with money he didn't have, the books I had lent him. He followed me, hovering in the doorway, his voice rising in panic. He asked what I was doing, why I was acting like this, as if I were the one who had committed the transgression. It was the audacity of it that fueled me. He really thought he could just shrug this off, that I would just be the accommodating, forgiving guy he had always known. I finished packing his life into 3 duffel bags, zipped them shut with a snap that sounded like a final judgment, and shoved them toward the front door. I pointed at the bags and then at the door. I finally spoke, and my voice sounded thin and unrecognizable to my own ears. I told him he had exactly 10 minutes to get out of my sight, and if he ever stepped foot in my building again, I would ensure that the entire world knew exactly what kind of person he really was. I wasn't just talking about Sarah. I was talking about the way he operated, the lies, the manipulation, the parasitic way he lived his life. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw a flash of genuine spite. He didn't apologize again. He didn't plead. He just tightened his jaw, grabbed his bags, and looked at me with a sneer that confirmed everything I had suspected. He was a coward, and he had always been a coward. He walked out the door, and as it clicked shut, I felt a vacuum in the room. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel like the hero of the story. I just felt empty, like someone had hollowed me out with a melon baller. But the real kicker was Sarah. I hadn't even had to deal with her yet. I knew she was coming over later that evening. We had plans to go to an exhibit, something we had talked about for weeks. I spent the next 4 hours walking around the apartment, touching things, trying to reclaim my own space. I cleaned the counters, I threw away the wine glasses, I scrubbed the bathroom. I was trying to exorcise their presence from my home, but the air still felt thick with them. Every corner of that apartment held a memory that was now a toxic asset. When the doorbell buzzed at 7 o'clock, I knew it was her. I didn't move. I let it buzz a second time, then a third. I finally walked to the door and unlocked it, leaning against the frame as she walked in, already talking about her day at the firm, her voice full of that casual, breezy energy that usually made me feel at ease. She stopped when she saw me. I hadn't turned on the lights, and the room was bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun. I was still wearing the same shirt, my face unshaven, my eyes likely bloodshot. She didn't have to say a word. She knew. She tried to play it cool at first, asking what was wrong, why I looked so terrible. She reached out to touch my arm, but I recoiled as if she were a hot stove. She pulled back, her face hardening instantly. There was no confusion in her eyes, just a sudden, defensive awareness. She asked if I had talked to him, and the way she said his name, so casually, as if he were just a mutual acquaintance, and not the man she had been in bed with while I was working to pay for our future, made my stomach turn. I didn't give her a long, dramatic speech. I didn't ask her why or how. I told her I knew, and I told her that she needed to leave. I told her that I had cleared out his things and that she was next. She tried to cry. She tried to explain that it was just a lapse, that it didn't mean anything. That word, anything, was the trigger. How could the woman I was planning a future with, the woman who had held my hand through the death of my father and the stress of my career, look me in the eye and say that something so profound was just nothing? I watched her face as she realized that there was no negotiation. She saw that I wasn't going to be the guy who stood there and listened to her justifications. I wasn't going to be the victim who stayed to be manipulated further. She grew angry then, and it was a cold, sharp anger. She started saying things, how I was always too focused on work, how I was never really present, how Tyler actually understood her in a way I never would. It was the classic defense of a betrayer. Blame the victim for their own infidelity. I didn't even respond. I just watched her, noting the way her hands moved, the way her voice cracked, the way she was already trying to rewrite the narrative so that she could be the victim of my coldness and emotional unavailability. It was a masterclass in self-deception. I opened the front door and held it, waiting. She stood there for a long time, her eyes burning with a mixture of resentment and confusion, and then she turned and walked out. She didn't look back. She didn't say goodbye. She just left, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft, final thud. I locked the door, engaged the deadbolt, and then leaned my forehead against the cold metal. I had done it. I had purged them both. I had reclaimed my space, my home, and my autonomy. But as I stood there in the silence of my own perfectly curated, perfectly empty condo, the crushing weight of it all finally caught up to me. I wasn't just alone. I was shattered. I had spent so much of my energy trying to be the guy who had it all together, the guy who could provide and protect and be the foundation, and all I had managed to do was build a pedestal for two people who didn't respect me enough to be honest. I walked to the kitchen and opened the fridge. It was full of food I had bought for our dinners, for the lunches we were supposed to share. I looked at it and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. I started grabbing everything, the produce, the milk, the expensive cuts of meat, and throwing it into the trash. I was sweating, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I was going through the motions of an emotional breakdown, but it felt oddly necessary. I was clearing the inventory of my past. By the time I was finished, the trash can was overflowing and I was exhausted. I sank to the floor, my back against the cabinets, and just stared at the ceiling. I had lost my best friend, I had lost my partner, and I had lost the version of myself that believed in the goodness of the people closest to me. I was 31 years old, living in a nice condo in Lincoln Park, with a steady career and a bright future, and I felt like I was drowning in the middle of a desert. I started thinking about the financial implications. The mortgage was all in my name, thankfully, but the credit card statements, the ones I hadn't checked in a few days, they were going to be a nightmare. Tyler had been using my secondary card for his emergency expenses. Sarah had left her name on the lease for my storage unit. It wasn't just a betrayal of the heart. It was a tangled mess of shared obligations and blurred lines. I needed to untangle them, and I needed to do it without losing my mind in the process. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a cheating scandal. I was dealing with a systematic exploitation of my life. I had been their host, their banker, their sounding board, and their scapegoat. Every time I had been generous, every time I had been understanding, I had just been giving them more room to maneuver around me. It was a humiliating realization, but it was also a liberating one. I no longer had to wonder if I was being a good enough partner or a good enough friend. I had been too good, and that had been my biggest mistake. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the apartment swallow me. I had a lot of work to do. I had to change my locks, I had to cancel my cards, I had to figure out how to navigate the social fallout when our mutual friends started asking questions. I was going to be the bad guy in their version of the story, I knew that. People who betray always get to the narrative first. They frame the story to make themselves feel less like the villain. I could already hear it. He was too controlling, he was too distant, he was too obsessed with his career. But I didn't care anymore. Let them talk. Let them build their little world of lies and see how long it held up. I had the truth, and the truth was that I had been used by the two people who were supposed to have my back. And that realization, while painful, was the most honest thing I had felt in years. I was alone, but I was finally, for the first time in a long time, truly free from the burden of their expectations. I drifted off into a restless sleep on the kitchen floor, the cold tile against my cheek. I dreamt of water, vast and dark, and of being pulled under by two hands that I recognized all too well. I woke up with a start, the morning light already creeping through the kitchen window, feeling like I had been beaten with a lead pipe. I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked to the window. The city was waking up, oblivious to the fact that I had just lost everything. I took a deep breath, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sat down at the table to start the work of dismantling the rest of my life. I had a lot of phone calls to make, and I was going to make every single one of them. The next 2 weeks were a blur of cold, mechanical efficiency that I didn't know I possessed. I became a man defined by logistics. I changed the locks on my front door within 24 hours of Sarah leaving, the sound of the new key clicking into the cylinder feeling like the only true accomplishment of my adult life. I contacted my bank, my credit card companies, and my cell phone provider to scrub them from every account they had even tangential access to. It was a humiliating process, having to explain to customer service representatives that my best friend and my girlfriend had been running up charges on my tab while I was quite literally working to pay for them. Every digit I entered, every password I reset was an act of severance. My social circle began to feel the tremors immediately. It started with a barrage of texts, mostly from Sarah, mostly dripping with the kind of performative concern that made my skin crawl. She wanted to talk. She wanted closure. She wanted to explain how confused she had been. I didn't reply to a single one. I blocked her number, then her email, then her social media. It was the digital equivalent of burning a bridge while the person is still standing on the other side. And God, did it feel good. Tyler was different. He didn't try to contact me at all, which was almost more insulting. He knew he had overstepped the boundary of no return. Instead, he went the coward's route, whispering to our mutual friends about how I had snapped and kicked him out over nothing, how he was worried about my mental state. One night, I ran into one of our mutual friends, Mark, at a bar in Lincoln Park. It was an accident, a place I usually frequented, and he happened to be there with his crew. The atmosphere was loud, the bass thumping against the brick walls, but the moment I saw them, the room seemed to shrink. Mark looked at me with a mix of pity and discomfort, the classic look of someone who has heard the propaganda and isn't quite sure how to handle the reality. He tried to corner me, asking if I was doing okay and if I was really going to cut Tyler off like that. I didn't lose my temper. I just looked at him and laid it out, flat and dry, just the facts. I told him about the credit card bills, the late-night rent payments I'd covered while they were using my bedroom as a stage for their affair, and the absolute lack of remorse I'd witnessed. I didn't raise my voice.
সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মনা মন সাগরে নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো সকলি যাই বিফলে ওরে রূপ সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মনা মন সাগরে নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো সকলি যাই বিফলে আহা সাগরের দুই মোহনা একটি আশা একটি যাওয়া সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা সাধক যাহারা নাই মোতারা সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা সাধক সারা যায় ডুবে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে সাগরের খাইছ ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে ওরে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো নিতে তার মোহনাতে ও এক সাগরের খাইছ ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো নিতে তার মোহনাতে ওরে মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা না জানিয়া যাব দিলে মন মরবি অকালে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে রূপসাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাইমা সাগরে আরে এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে গো ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে ওরে রূপসাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাইমা সাগরে এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে গো ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে ওরে জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা জুয়ার আসলে যাই ডুবে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে
I didn't look like I was having a breakdown. I just presented the evidence, and I watched the color drain from Mark's face. The pity in his eyes shifted to something sharper, realization, and then disgust. He wasn't disgusted with me. He was starting to see the truth. That was when I realized the power of the narrative. They had the head start, but truth, when delivered without the heat of emotion, is a much more effective weapon. My professional life, surprisingly, became my sanctuary. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of the projects I managed felt like a relief. There was no ambiguity in a deadline. There was no betrayal in a budget report. I threw myself into the work, pulling 15-hour days, making myself indispensable. My boss noticed, of course, but for once, the accolades didn't feel like pressure. They felt like a distraction, a way to keep my hands busy so I wouldn't have to reach for my phone to see if there were any new, agonizing notifications. I was building a new fortress, one made of billable hours and professional milestones, and it was impenetrable. But the silence in the apartment at night remained the biggest challenge. The furniture seemed to hold echoes. Every time I walked past the guest room, I could still see the image of his bags, the way he had looked at me before he walked out. I started rearranging everything. I sold the stationary bike that he used to brag about using but never touched. I replaced the bedding, the rugs, even the curtains in the living room. I spent thousands of dollars just to strip the aesthetic of our shared life away. It was a renovation, but instead of trying to make it beautiful, I was just trying to make it unrecognizable. I wanted to wake up in a place that had no connection to the version of myself that had been so easily manipulated. One evening, I found a box of old photos in the back of the linen closet, a relic from a trip the three of us had taken to a cabin in Wisconsin 2 years ago. I sat there for a long time, looking at the smiles. We looked so happy, so connected. It was sickening. I thought about the time I had spent driving them, the money I had spent on the cabin rental, the way I had played the role of the provider, the anchor. It was all a farce. They were probably looking at each other behind my back even then. I took the photos and, rather than tearing them up, I took a lighter to the corner of the stack and watched them curl into ash in the kitchen sink. It wasn't cathartic in a movie montage way. It was just a chore, a necessary cleanup. The financial betrayal, though, kept coming back to haunt me. I discovered that Tyler hadn't just been crashing on my couch. He had been using my address to apply for credit cards in my name, redirecting the mail to a P.O. box he had set up months ago. When I finally got a notification from a credit monitoring service about a suspicious inquiry, the sheer audacity of it left me gasping for air. It wasn't just a friend who had slept with my girlfriend. It was a thief who had been trying to systematically ruin my credit score while living in my spare room. I didn't hesitate. I went straight to the police station. I didn't care about the friendship anymore. I didn't care about the social fallout or what people would say. I filed a report for identity theft and fraud. When the officer asked for the details, I laid out everything: the unauthorized charges, the intercepted mail, the abuse of trust. He looked at me with a mix of sympathy and professional distance. I wasn't just a guy who had been cheated on. I was a victim of a crime. That shift in status changed everything. The victimhood was gone. The fight was on. I remember walking out of the police station into the sharp autumn air of Chicago. The leaves were starting to turn, the city preparing for the long, cold winter. I felt a weird sense of peace. I had stopped running from the pain and started attacking the source. I knew there would be a long, drawn-out process, lawyers, investigators, the works, but I felt equipped to handle it. The emotional damage was still there, a dull, throbbing ache in my chest, but it was becoming manageable. I wasn't the guy who was crying on the kitchen floor anymore. I was the guy who was holding a police report, preparing to take down someone who had once been the closest thing I had to a brother. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't look at the empty rooms with dread. I looked at them as a blank slate. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one who had finally decided when and where the next shoe would fall. I sat down with a glass of scotch and a notebook, listing every single financial discrepancy, every piece of documentation I needed to gather, every witness I needed to contact. I was methodical. I was cold. I was, for the first time in my life, completely unburdened by the need to be a good guy. Being good had gotten me nothing but a ruined credit score and a broken heart. It was time to be someone else. The loneliness was still there, of course. It sat on my chest like a lead weight in the quiet hours between 3 and 5 in the morning. I still caught myself reaching for my phone to tell Sarah about something funny I'd seen at work, or thinking about a beer with Tyler after a hard week. But those impulses were dying out, replaced by a reflexive, defensive recoil. I didn't miss them. I missed the idea of them, the comfort of a life I thought was real. Once you realize the foundation is rotten, you don't miss the house. You just wonder how you lived in it for so long without noticing the smell. I started seeing a lawyer the following week. She was a sharp-tongued woman who specialized in financial fraud, and she didn't care about the emotional side of the story. She only cared about the paper trail. When I showed her the evidence of the P.O. backs and the fraudulent credit applications, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a thin, knowing smile. "This isn't just a breakup, honey," she said. "This is a case of systematic exploitation. We're going to bury him." Hearing her say that felt like the first breath of air after being underwater for a month. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was planning. I knew that Tyler's entire life was built on a series of shaky, poorly managed decisions, and that he had nothing to fall back on. My lawyer explained that by the time we were finished, he wouldn't just be out of my life. He would be legally and financially unable to hide from what he had done. It felt cruel, and it felt like justice. I stopped caring about the moral implications of getting even. I had been played for a fool, and now I was going to make sure that the price of that game was more than he could afford to pay. I walked home after that meeting, the city lights feeling like they were illuminating a path I had chosen for myself. I saw my reflection in a shop window, the sharp set of my jaw, the cold focus in my eyes, and I barely recognized myself. I looked like a man who had been through a war and had come out the other side with nothing left to lose. And, in a way, that was exactly who I was. I had lost the people I loved, but I had found something else, a hardening, a sharpness, a reality that I could actually build on. The final phase of this saga didn't happen in a dramatic courtroom showdown, nor did it involve the screaming matches I once imagined. It happened in the quiet, sterile offices of an attorney's conference room, a place where people go to trade their integrity for a settlement. By the time the meeting was set, Tyler had nowhere left to turn. My lawyer had done her work with the kind of clinical precision that would have made a surgeon jealous. She had traced the box, the unauthorized credit lines, and the trail of payments he had siphoned from my accounts under the guise of utility expenses. When he walked into that room, he wasn't the cocky guy who had swaggered around my apartment in a towel anymore. He looked aged, his suit a size too large, his eyes shifting nervously toward the door. Sarah wasn't there, and I hadn't heard a word from her in months. I had heard through the grapevine that she'd moved out of the city, likely because the social fallout of being caught in such a blatant, greedy lie had made it impossible for her to keep her head high in our circles. I didn't care where she went. She was a footnote, a temporary diversion that had served as the catalyst for my own transformation. The person sitting across from me was the real problem, the one who had treated my friendship as an investment portfolio to be liquidated for his own benefit. My lawyer didn't waste time. She laid the documentation out on the mahogany table like a deck of cards. She didn't yell, she didn't need to. She just pointed at the totals, the dates, and the signatures, each one a nail in the coffin of his credibility. Tyler tried to speak, tried to offer some weak, pathetic excuse about how he was just going through a hard time, but his voice died out when he saw the look on my face. I wasn't angry. I was finished. I stared at him with such absolute indifference, but it clearly unnerved him more than any outburst would have. I had reached a point where he was no longer even worth the energy of my hatred. He agreed to the terms of the settlement within an hour. He would pay back every cent, he would sign a document acknowledging the fraud, and he would stay out of my life and the lives of anyone I knew. It was a complete surrender. As he stood up to leave, he paused, looking at me with something that looked suspiciously like a genuine attempt at regret. He started to say, "I never meant for it to," but I cut him off with a single sharp gesture of my hand. I didn't want to hear it. The apology was a luxury he didn't earn, and listening to it would have been a concession I wasn't willing to make. I turned my back on him, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline, and when I turned back around, the room was empty. The feeling of relief wasn't immediate, but it was absolute. I walked out of that building into a crisp, biting afternoon. The air felt cleaner, sharper, as if a layer of grime had been scrubbed off the surface of the world. I didn't go home immediately. I walked to a bar near the river, sat by the window, and ordered a drink. I thought about the year I had just lived through, the confusion, the pain, the rage, the long nights of wondering if I was the problem. I realized then that the most important thing I had learned wasn't about them. It was about me. I had been a man who defined his worth by his capacity to give, and I had been surrounded by people who were more than happy to take until there was nothing left. I changed my life in the following months. I started traveling, taking on projects that actually challenged me, and I kept my circle tighter than a drum. I didn't let anyone into the inner sanctum of my life easily, and I certainly didn't let anyone crash on my couch without a clear, rigid timeline and a healthy dose of skepticism. My apartment, which had once felt like a museum of my own failures, became a home again. I painted the walls, changed the furniture, and made it into a place that reflected who I actually was, not who I wanted others to think I was. I still see Sarah's name pop up in old emails or group chats every now and then, a ghost from a different lifetime. I delete them without reading. I don't wonder if she's happy, and I don't care if she regrets it. That version of me, the one who needed her approval, the one who needed to feel like he was a good guy in her eyes, is dead. I replaced him with someone who values his own peace, his own resources, and his own integrity, above the hollow validation of people who never deserved my trust in the first place. I often think about that night in the living room, the night I came home to the sound of that laughter. It was the moment the floor dropped out from under me, the moment my entire world was revealed to be a fragile, beautiful lie. If I could go back, I wouldn't stop myself from walking into that apartment. I wouldn't try to protect my younger self from the pain. Because as much as it hurt, it was the necessary fire. It burned away the dead weight. It taught me the value of being able to say no, the power of walking away, and the absolute necessity of guarding your own life from those who would use it as a scaffold to climb their own way up. I'm sitting in my living room now, the same one where I once sat in the dark and felt my life splinter into pieces. It's quiet here, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's the quiet of a life that I have built, brick by brick, with no one else's influence to weaken the mortar. I have a new life, one that is leaner, sharper, and far more honest. I don't have a best friend to call, but I have a sense of clarity that is worth more than any companionship built on a foundation of lies. I learned the hard way that when someone tells you who they are, you should listen. But more importantly, I learned that when you stop trying to fix everyone else's problems, you finally have the time to fix your own. I look out at the city, the lights of Chicago blinking in the distance, and I realize that the city hasn't changed. It's still the same place, full of the same people, the same potential for betrayal, the same chaos. But I am different. I am no longer the victim of my own generosity. I am the architect of my own reality.
And for the first time in my life, I am not just surviving. I am living, fully and entirely on my own terms. The rent is paid, the doors are locked, and for the first time in a very long time, I am completely, peacefully, and unapologetically at home.
কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি, কার নিয়ে চলো, আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো। কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি, কার নিয়ে চলো, আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো। কার মনেতে তোমার আশা রাখো জমা করে, আমার আশা পুইরা দিয়া তুমি রইলা দূরে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। আসলে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশা গুলো দিয়ে, চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে। বাসলে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশা গুলো দিয়ে, চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে। তোর প্রেমেরই মন্ত্র ছিল অভিনয়ের জাল, তোর কথা বিশ্বাস কইরা হইল আমার কাল। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। স্বার্থ নিয়া করলে খেলায় আমার সাথে রে, পর ভাবিয়া দূরে গেলে আমায় রেখে রে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর।